This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Dalia Shenlin, my podcaster in arms, is away today, sadly. My guest is a geography and architecture scholar at University College London. He's also the co-editor of a new book entitled Urban Geopolitics, Rethinking Planning in Contested Cities. It was recently published in English by Routledge. The book compiles studies of 15 cities around the world, tackled from a comparative perspective, offering fresh takes on the study of contested urbanisms. Dr. Jonathan Rokem, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, thank you very much, Gilad. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I'd like to start by asking you about your purview as a geographer and scholar of architecture, studying social divisions in urban environments. How is your scholarly endeavor different from that of, say, sociologists or anthropologists who are also interested in the same issues? What do you think are the main tenets that your discipline brings to the debate?
Okay, I think the main added value, which definitely has a broad spectrum, but in my work I look at spatial understandings of these questions, how the actual geography and how actual space becomes very significant in understanding politics, and especially politics in the cities themselves, how different manifestations of conflict and violence and other forms of segregation, which is the more long-term perspective of these questions, is manifested in space.
So space meaning the way our environment is designed, is contained. What do you mean exactly?
It's a lot of things. It's not one or the other. I think it's the combination of all these things. So what I look at is my own work is looking at transport infrastructure. It's looking at housing. And it's mainly looking how people can actually communicate and meet in space. So basically this connection, how space creates or doesn't connect people, is a very critical question in my work.
But also space is obviously affected by the people who design it. Where do you draw the line, if you draw it at all?
I would say it's looking at my own work, which has been focusing mainly on Jerusalem and Stockholm, very different places to compare.
We're going to get to that.
I'm sure. So I'm just kind of giving a preview. What I'm trying to do is to show that, yes, definitely the design of space is critical, but the use of space is more critical. So design doesn't always mean that people use it the way it was intended. And actually the best places, the most well-functioning spaces are usually the ones that are not designed but actually created by various either political or other constructions which create a public space.
Right. I'd like now to unpack the subheadline of your book, which is Rethinking Planning in Contested Cities. Let's take it one by one. Rethinking planning. How is the view that you present and promote in the book different from the view that was established before?
Well, it has many different ways of doing that. I think there are two main, I would say, connections that we're trying to make to this question. One is that what has been planned is usually focused on where people live and not so much on where people move. And what we're trying to do is to show that movement in cities is a very critical part of how to understand urban segregation, urban contestation, opportunities for interaction. We frame it as co-presence, which is this idea that you're in the same spaces as other people, not necessarily interacting with them, but still present, still in a space which allows for potential interaction. So that's something which planning hasn't looked at traditionally. It's been much more focused on master planning, these big questions, looking at buildings, looking at how these buildings are connected to things, but not actually how the people themselves communicate.
It's going back to what you just said about focusing on design rather than how people use the space, right? That's really the shift.
Yes. The other shift is that what we're trying to do in the book is trying to relocate what planning is about from being what has been a very geographical divide between the global north and the global south. So looking at the developing world, obviously these are in question because they're contested by the book. But this idea that there's a difference between what happens in Europe and the US versus what's happening in other parts of the world. So what the book is trying to do is trying to show a very broad, very kind of, I would say, comparative understanding of how these micro geopolitical spaces function in different cities, and understanding that from I would say, this ordinary cities perspective, which is something Jenny Robinson, scholar from UCL, working a lot in comparative studies, published quite a few books on this question, is trying to do, moving away from this idea that cities are separate, cities are either global or developing or something in between, to look at cities as a much more plural understanding, and this idea that you can start learning about how planning can be rethought from any part of the world. So it's not just based on these big New York, London and Paris, so on, but we need to start looking at other parts. So this idea of relocating what planning is about to other parts.
So there are common traits to cities around the world, but then again, your comparative perspective, as you presented in the book, which I found very interesting but also very problematic, is focusing on dissimilarities, on differences rather than similarities, which kind of opens the door to an endless debate. It's really, really open-ended because the similarities are generally relatively few and easily defined. That's why comparative scholars, I'm assuming, chose to focus on similarities, because you could list them or at least tackle them in a more or less manageable way. But differences are just everywhere, especially when it comes to such intricate research objects as cities. How do you even approach that?
Okay, so the book is trying to make that argument, and what we're trying to say is that instead of looking at these bigger trends, which you're actually questioning, we're trying to pick out specific patterns to actually make these comparisons work. So obviously my own work has influenced and been building on these ways of thinking. But I think what the book is trying to do is to make it a much broader way. But then we look at transport infrastructure, we look at where housing is built, by whom it's built, who is actually benefiting from these initiatives. So in a way, we're trying to kind of make these comparisons of difference, but following very clear patterns that we use as a comparative kind of imaginational way of looking at different parts of these cities. So we're breaking it down, and what we're arguing is that when you use a very concrete case study, you can actually make it work. I can give you examples if you want. I mean, my own work, as you obviously already mentioned, has done this in Jerusalem and Stockholm. What we learned from Jerusalem is actually that the public transport system, mainly the new light rail, has actually created an opportunity for interaction. While because of the way the city is laid out, this is very spatial. And because of this idea that the neighborhoods actually do connect quite closely to these stations, we've mapped that using space syntax, which is a methodology that actually is able to show who will actually be able to walk to these parts. Then there's the political part of it as well, which is who will and who won't, depending on their own affiliation. So it's more complicated than just that. But when you add all these layers, you can see that this new light rail is actually a potential for interaction, a potential for a meeting of ultra-Orthodox Jews, of secular Jews, of Palestinians on the same transport network, which wasn't there before. This network is quite new, 2011. Before that, the bus systems were quite separate. Obviously, there were some Palestinians using the Israeli side, but very few Israelis are on the Palestinian bus services in the east part of the city. So basically, transport infrastructure is a potential for integrative and meeting different populations. In Stockholm, on the other hand, the Tunnelbana, which is the name of the transport network at the metro there, it actually, we're arguing, disconnects Swedish populations from immigrants who are living in the outskirts of the city. So what we've done is we've actually advised the transport authorities in Stockholm, showing them the Jerusalem example, to how actually they can start thinking of where they're locating their new stations at the end of the lines, and if they actually mix it with more Swedish users, which creates this opportunities for interaction, which is currently lacking in the Swedish context. So this is just one anecdote. And in the book, we do that through the various chapters, obviously written by experts who come from these parts of the world and have done mainly, usually it's PhD students or postdocs who have written about these spaces as part of their research, showing how these different aspects can work in all these different parts.
So how do you choose? Why did you, I mean, you're from Jerusalem, so it kind of makes sense, but why Stockholm and not any other city in the world?
My personal choice of Stockholm is because my family is from Stockholm. I speak the language. I'm relatively well acquainted with it. That's another argument, that if you want to do these comparisons and you want to be very, I would say, clear about what you're saying and make sense to not only the international but the local audience, you need to know the spaces very well. So I'm against this idea that you go and you parachute into a city, you do a 1-2 weeks interview, with a few people, and then you come out and write this comparative paper. I think it's a much longer process.
You said, I want to pick up on something that you said almost in passing. Do you see that your work as having an applicable horizon? Do you see yourself as working with policymakers as, the end result of what you do?
I'll give you a very straightforward answer. I just came back from Brussels. I was there this week, where I was invited to speak to a conference on the European Week of Regions and Cities. I was basically talking to about 300 policymakers in the room who were listening to these ideas that I just presented, obviously using much more of a kind of in-depth understanding. But there was a lot of interest, and there's also this kind of understanding in the EU as a construction. They need to start opening up their debates, not only continue to look at their own cases, which is what they've been doing quite a lot, but actually looking at other parts of the world, especially with what's happening in Europe at the moment, which is there's a clear kind of movement towards the right, and we need to start countering that, not only in politics, but also in policy.
Mm-hmm. But then again, it comes back to what we spoke about in the beginning of this conversation, that, really what your focus is and how people use the space rather than how policymakers and people design the space. How does that interact? Because on the one hand, you study the people who, in a way, resist the planning from above, and at the same time you go to the people who design from above and tell them, okay, this is how it should be done. How does that tension resolve itself, if it does at all?
I wouldn't say it does. I think that's part of being a planner. You have to be a mediator. You have to actually, and a geographer as well, working in these situations, you have to be aware of all the different views, and this is part of this community participation versus understanding the more authority and kind of municipal side of the question. This is something I've been doing for the last 20 years in various contexts. So I think it's an ongoing process, and each of the cases that you're working on has its own internal dynamic. So it's a lot about reading these different actors and trying to make them work together rather than against each other.
Do you think that part of the evolution of your field has also manifested itself in planning becoming more reactive? I mean, is it more of a dialectical process than it was before?
I think in some places, yes. I mean, this is a part of the politics of a place. I mean, you'll see in the book that some of the chapters will have a much more in-depth understanding of the reactiveness of planning, of the bottom-up perspective of how this is being done. But then in other cases, it's much more complicated because there's a political situation which doesn't allow the same level of engagement from below. So I would say this has to do with the local culture, the local immediate connection between politicians and the people who are engaged in trying to make things better from their perspective. And I think in this case, just to sum that up, mapping is very important. When you start showing people the visual side, and this is what I've tried to do both in my academic work, but also when I go and show these images and figures and analysis to the policymakers, it makes a big difference. Because if they can actually see how suddenly train system, which was very separated, becomes integrated, and you show that visually, it actually makes them think for that side of the story rather than just looking at the potential economic and other needs, which are the usual ones that are being targeted.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's go back to the tagline of the book. The other part of it is contested cities. And you also elaborate in the book that you chose contested specifically as opposed to divided and other words that have been in use. Why is this distinction important?
Well, it's a bit of a theoretical distinction. I personally think contested captures a lot of different ways of understanding what's happening in space, rather than the division part of it usually focuses on the one spatial side of things. And there is polarized, there's other ways that have been coined. I'm not saying anything wrong. I think from my side of the story, the interdisciplinary understanding of contested spaces is the way to actually make that clear. I've been critiqued for it as well, and rightly so, for being too general and not being specific enough. But I think in this comparative universe that I'm trying to look at and trying to relationally understand how these different processes can be useful to actually impact policies. I mean, when you tell the local Swede that you can actually learn some interesting things from the Jerusalem way of doing transport infrastructure, they don't really get it. So, I mean, these things are obviously beyond the usual way of thinking, but when you start showing people how it actually does work and how it could be done better, then I think that's when they start realizing that, maybe we can learn something from spaces that are obviously usually seen as the most problematic, and they still are in some cases. And in the literature, Jerusalem has always been one of the most divided and problematic cases to solve. But when you start looking at the context, the spatial layout of a city, how it's creating opportunities, that's where it becomes becomes interesting.
All right, putting Jerusalem and its numerous divisions and problems aside for a second, what does it mean, contested? I mean, because divisions and inequalities and all those things that are, the opposite of harmony, the disharmoniousness, is really the essence of the urban experience, right? In many ways. So it's like also a very open-ended definition, not just contested, but also divided. And any kind of way to try and categorize cities this way just, tries to cast the net a bit too wide.
Okay, so let me rephrase. All cities are contested in some way or another, and I agree with you completely. And this is a critique which is valid, I think, and it's something that I'm working with rather than against. But I think that in many ways, when you start looking at the patterns and how these different contestations, as I call them, play out across these different patterns, then it becomes much more clear that on the local case study level, this becomes interesting. I agree with you on a general level. It's a very broad understanding, and that's why the book is really moving us from these overarching understandings of contestations to looking at what actually happens in the cases. And that's, I think, where the value is in this approach. So it definitely is very broad and not completely defined, but that's the beauty of it, that you can actually use it in any context that you choose.
So the 15 cities that were chosen were pretty much chosen at random because the researchers themselves were more connected to them or were more, familiar with the environments they were studying. I mean, it could have just easily been hundreds of other cities.
It could have, but I think there's a structure and logic. It's not completely random. I mean, when you start looking at it, and there's a map in the book which kind of shows you how the cities are laid out across the globe, there is some kind of geographical focus on different regions. And the idea here is that each of these regions has a different dynamic, and there's some internal conversations in some of the chapters in the regions. Africa, for instance, very specifically represented by two cities, which is problematic. But then there's a lot to learn from these two cases that might be interesting. That's more only focusing on housing and policy and kind of how different community versus government initiatives create new ways of being part of the housing market. It's interesting we have similar problems in Europe, we have similar problems in other parts of the world. Maybe Africa is an interesting place to learn from. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of what the book's trying to do. It's not saying we're covering everything, we can't, but we're saying let's start to see how we can make these different cases talk to each other.
Are you trying to set up ideal types in one way or another?
Not really. No? Trying to avoid that, actually.
Okay.
The ideal types is what this kind of ordinary perspective is trying to critique and say there is no ideal type. It's a bit like there's no Plato here. Mm-hmm. It's more Aristotle. It's more relational kind of comparisons of different parts of how philosophy can be used to understand differences in cities.
Some cities are more contested than others. Jerusalem is by far more contested than Stockholm. We don't need to elaborate about Jerusalem because everybody knows, not even the regular listeners of this podcast. I think that, if you just pick out someone random on the street anywhere in the world, they would know at least something about Jerusalem and its many problems. But what can you tell us about the contestations in Stockholm? To me, at least, and to many others, I'm assuming, it seems like this rather, peaceful, modern, well-functioning city. What kind of tensions and contestations are there?
There's lots, but I think to kind of create a bit of a lens to what you asked, I mean, Stockholm is a very well-functioning city, and it has a lot of good planning for it, and it's been obviously master planned, and there's been a lot of very, I would say, and still is used as a model for how cities can function. It's, from an environmental perspective, one of the more sustainable cities, but I would argue from the social perspective, it's not so sustainable, and that has to do with migration. Migration has been a major problem or issue, both politically, but also generally. How do we deal with it? What are we doing with these people? How do we create a better future for them, but also let them be part of our society? Obviously, it's not only Sweden, it's Europe in general at the moment, which is going through a bit of a transition following post-2015 when the major waves came. But this has started in the early 90s in Stockholm with a lot of people coming from post-conflict areas. So it's basically places like Bosnia, like Somalia, like Iraq, more recently Syria, when it all kind of overfled or became an overflow of populations coming. And in many ways, what the Swedish state has done, and there are different migration agencies, is put these people in very excluded parts of the cities. The big cities It's not true for all the cities. Malmö is different from Gothenburg and Stockholm. It has it more closer to the center. But generally, there was the Million Homes program, which was this very massive self-build construction of the state, 1 million new flats over 10 years in the 60s and 70s, creating these new modernist, well-connected, at least that's what they were at the time, to the center, with the tube and the metro kind of being part of that link. Now, since the 90s, most of these flats have been vacant or been available, and that's where all these new immigrants have been housed. It's quite unique, by the way, that Sweden is letting these people both receive a house, receive lots of subsidies. There is a lot of good things about what's happening in Sweden. I'm not saying it's only wrong, but what's happened in the process is that these places have become very segregated. This has to do with the spatial layout of them and not being able to walk, cycle, or have any real communication with the center because they're far out. So if you're a younger population, or if you're a younger immigrant and you're going to a school where 100% of the people are from immigrant backgrounds, so there's very little connection in the education system to Swedish populations, which moved out as this started to happen in the 90s. So basically, there's a clear ethnic divide going on in Stockholm, but also in the other big cities of Sweden. So Gothenburg would be the other good example where there's similar patterns. And this is creating this connection. And 2013, there were quite, I would say, well-documented riots. I mean, on a scale, they were not that big, but still they made a big impact. And the feeling is that the current politics in Sweden has been impacted by that. I'm not sure how much you follow that, but the current situation is that the right wing have about a fifth of the parliament seats, and now there's no way of creating a government because they're kind of the in-between, they're the balance. So basically, there has been a shift of the social democratic very well-meaning values to a much more, I would say, populist way of understanding how these spaces should be managed. So what we're doing here, and this is kind of trying to point into what I'm trying to explain, is that we're trying to say, yes, you've created this problem and this division and this spatial layout of the city, which is basically reinforcing these problems. How can you change that? It's very hard to do in the housing because housing is very fixed. It's easier to do in the transport. So we're saying if you're starting to look at transport as a way of making more connections to other neighborhoods, to other parts of the city, you could stop this current situation, which I think isn't helping. Just as an anecdote, I told my grandmother who lives in Stockholm that I'm actually going out to do research on these parts. The place I've been looking at is Fittja, in the southern periphery of Stockholm. And their reaction was, oh, how can you actually go there? It's very dangerous. So my response is, I grew up in Jerusalem and I could probably handle it. But, you know, there's this kind of popular feeling that these places are beyond what you're allowed to go to. It's a bit like, if you want to use the same, and again, going back, but kind of parts of cities which are not safe. And this is quite new. This is the last 10 or 15 to 20 years that this has become such a big issue, and it's creating a big debate in Sweden. So what we're trying to say is, how can we change this? How can we make things work and have these populations, I wouldn't say integration because that's a contested word, but definitely part of Swedish society and not completely excluded from the public room, if you want to use that as a word.
So basically your job is to right old wrongs, mistakes that were made 50 or 60 years ago and are still with us because, as you say, apartment blocks are there to stay. And, they were housed, they were given a place to stay. So, of course, nobody can accuse the Swedish government of any sort of neglect. But, it's just the structural way things are that you stand up against in some sort of sad uphill battle.
It's not only me. There are lots of others.
You and others, of course. Yeah.
There's a clear movement, and there's quite a few different researchers, but also activists that I partly work with in my research that are trying to make a difference. And I think slowly, we're also seeing a lot of these people entering the politics in Sweden, more on the municipal level at the moment, but it's a question of time before they have a representation on the national level as well. And these things change how they're perceived. They are actually getting more political power as we speak. They haven't, again, created a national representation, but I would think that might be a future scenario.
Yeah. Going back to the issue of immigration, that has become, as you said, in Europe, but also elsewhere, a major issue. In many ways, most of the cities, if not all of them, in the 21st century are global cities. They are the hub of a flow of population, and not just populations, but, people just come and go all the time. How does that affect the understanding of urbanism? Are all cities now contested because of that, because of immigration? How does it work?
I'm going to shift that to actually focus on the title of the book,
Okay.
Urban Geopolitics, which I think encapsulates what you're asking. The argument that I'm working on at the moment and developing in the future research project is that cities are the actual answer to these migration problems, because they're the ones who have to deal with the problems. I mean, nation states, I would argue, failing us on these questions. They're not doing enough, the most they do is close their borders, but they don't really, when people come to different parts of Europe or the rest of the world, the cities are where they go. And the cities is where these questions have to be dealt with. I mean, it's the same in Tel Aviv, it's the same in other big cities anywhere, where the municipality and the local city administration is the one that has to answer and create opportunities and structures for the people. So what I'm trying to say here, and this is another part of this book, is that urban geopolitics is not about geopolitics as a kind of national construction, which is what was the post-war focus, but it's actually how cities become geopolitical actors. And in the migration questions, they already are. They have much more to do and say connected to what's happening with how these populations are either accepted or not accepted. And I would say political power has a lot more to actually engage with than the nation state. The nation state here is not really a geopolitical actor. It's the cities that have the answer to these questions. And this is another side of the book as well, which I think is picked up also towards the end, where we have a conversation with Michael Sapphire, which is one of the, I would say, leading people who had this idea of cosmopolitan urbanism, how you can create cosmopolitanism as a way forward. So to go back to the contestation part of it, that's just a framing. I mean, we're not actually, when we drill down, we look at much more fine-tuned understandings. I mean, the contestation part is to try to create this comparative flexibility, which, yes, has its caveats. But I guess my main point here is that to do research that is comparative and valuable on difference, you have to be very specifically engaged in the case studies and in the actual context that you're looking at. That's the answer.
It sounds to me that you're pretty hopeful, after all, that at the end of the day, despite the many, many problems that all this poses, we as a society deal with them relatively well.
Well, I'm not sure I would be completely convinced by that, but
Relatively well.
I think there is obviously opportunities. There is a lot of goodwill, especially in cities, which, again, I'm being a bit critical towards the nation state, but I think that's where things at the moment need some kind of shift. I think the general debates are moving in the wrong directions, and I think cities have a very important role here. And I'm now going to go back to, just as an example, look at London in the Brexit debate and say that's another part of my future research, that this idea that this sovereignty, or this kind of idea that city identity and the kind of city citizen of the city is where most of the people will identify, more than with other questions where they feel that they're not represented enough. And I think that could be done in any country if you go there.
Yeah, I mean, it's no coincidence that the only place in England that was overwhelmingly pro-Remain was London, right?
And a few other, Liverpool, there are a few other the big cities actually where that happened. And unfortunately, when the vote was done, many of these people who are usually busy and not as interested as some of the kind of country folk didn't even go and vote. So that's kind of what happens in these democratic, very important, critical questions, is that a lot of the populations that are actually much more for pluralism, and this has to do again with cities being mixed, cities being much more ethnically diverse, this idea of that you actually know what other people are like. It's not just this sense of fear, going back to Sweden, that these immigrants in the suburbs, they're very dangerous. We don't really want to go there. So if you're living in a big diverse city like London and other parts of the UK, which has a very different spatial layout, by the way, I'm not going to go into detail, but that's a key, I think. Spatial layout, who can connect, who's seeing who.
What does it say really about political questions such as, jurisdiction and sovereignty? Do you see like a gradual movement towards greater devolution of powers to cities from the states?
Really context specific, I would say. In some parts, yes. In others, I'm going to be a bit cautious, because in some parts of the world that's already happening or happened. In other parts of the world it's not. But that's
okay. Let me rephrase the question. Is that something that you could see as more beneficial to tackling the problems that you spot in
the answer is in the title. Urban geopolitics is the way forward, at least the way I can kind of perceive the role of cities. And again, it's not only about these big national or global cities, it's also about how the small cities have a part of the cake, if you like.
Yeah. All right, Dr. Jonathan Rokem, a geography and architecture scholar at UCL, the co-editor of the new book, Urban Geopolitics, Rethinking Planning in Contested Cities. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
And also big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Itai Shalom, our producer, and of course to the Van Leer Institute for the generous support. And now we have a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you this. Please consider writing us a review. Just launch the app, select our podcast in the library section, scroll down to ratings and review, and then press a review and write one. Check out our archive with close to 500 interviews, and if you like what we do here, please like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel. Don't forget to follow me and Dalia on Twitter, and of course to join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.